Michael, we find in our research that about half of workloads are running on managed Kubernetes in some form, mainly EKS, AKS, GKE on one of the hyperscalers. And the other 50 are running, somewhere else, often in the corporate data center. The reason why those are so popular, those public cloud managed ones, is because developers can just consume them, and it's very quick, right? It's very convenient. There's nothing to worry about. And that's where the problems start for the operations guys.
Yeah. I mean, I think, a couple of years ago, I started thinking about this issue as like variation is the enemy. And when as an application developer, you don't care because you have one thing. But if you are in operations or, management or whatever you want to call administrators and sysadmins, like you're typically in charge of a lot of different things. And so like anytime something's different, right, it causes friction. And so I think that is, if you are a manager of your organization's Kubernetes usage, all the various things you're using, you really want to take advantage of one of the core principles of Kubernetes, which is to eliminate variation, right? To have like one way of representing, one way of managing, one way of installing, one way of reconciling, right? Like this is the main thing that I admire, I guess, about the audacity of Kubernetes, is to say like, we're finally just going to solve that problem.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of the promise of OpenStack fulfilled in many ways.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that we should schedule an even longer podcast, because there's not that many of us around who, know OpenStack well enough and live through it to kind of compare these errors and see, I don't know. That's always fun pondering.
I think a lot of enterprises have learned that they need to be careful with things like AKS, EKS, GKE. They are fantastic and you should consume them, but they're almost a little bit like those old VMware vending machines, right? Where it's very easy to consume a whole bunch of stuff, but you have to make sure you keep a governance layer on top of it, or you'll have security problems. We had an earlier podcast on that. You have policy compliance things. You can't pull a unified audit. You have all kinds of issues.
I think a lot of those things, just to try to pull drag my theory into it, right, comes from that variation, right? And not only in the underlying infrastructure, but as you're saying with governance, in the way that people use it, right? The way they configure it, their expectations, especially when it comes to developers of like, how do we instrument this application so it can be manageable, right? And if you have like 5 different applications you're running in your organization, that's can be annoying. If you have 50, it's annoying. But if you're like, a big government or a retailer or a bank, and you have like 5,000, like you're going to get lost. If you don't standardize even the simplest things, like what is running, right? Like just like the things you would never really think about, that like once you introduce a huge amount of variation in how that is reported, represented, and collected, you start to bog down and kind of just cruds everything up.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is when we look at postmortems of big Kubernetes incidents, disasters, problems, a lot of them you find in newspapers, others you don't, where you just interview somebody and they tell you why they had to call in their team on the weekend and why this crazy freak incident happened, that the whole cluster was offline, even though they thought it was entirely redundant. And almost in all of those cases, the issue lies in the environment, not in the Kubernetes cluster. It looks like it's totally, everything is as it should be, but there's a DNS issue. There is something in the networking layer. And then on those public clouds, it's a support issue, right? Because the network guys are not supporting Kubernetes, and then that's where a lot of people lose a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. I've seen recently. Kind of not surprising.
Yeah, no, I think as you were saying, right, like the way it's used and configured can cause a tremendous amount of problems. And I think when it comes to ideas of like you're saying, all the managed services and all the distros and I don't know, like multi-cloud or whatever, right? Like the overly clever way of thinking about it, I've started having is just like, well, if you just substitute the word like computers or even just cloud for Kubernetes, then like, of course, right? Like, of course, you're going to have many of them running many different versions, and like you want to standardize how it's done, and you want tools that can deal with all these different versions, right?
And you don't want to get accused, and that's the biggest thing, you really don't want to get accused of stifling innovation, right?
Sure.
So you have to do all this governance without stifling innovation.
Yeah. And I think to be the more mature veteran person in computer land here, right? Like we solve this problem over and over again, right? Like it's easy to introduce like layers. We even have a phrase for it, a layer of abstraction, right? Like you introduce a layer of abstraction. That's right. But, you know, we understand that you try to as you go down the infrastructure stack, you try to standardize as much as possible, and you try to you kind of carve out the flexibility that application developers at the top can have. You try to standardize the further down the stack you go. And if you can't standardize it as much as you would like, you try to limit the choices your application developers have about the infrastructure, right? You kind of hide it from them. So like as we talked about in a previous conversation, right? Like your application developers shouldn't really have to do anything with networking. Like that doesn't make sense. So you don't want to say it this way to an application developer, but you restrict them from messing with networking. And you might even have them make up their own fantasy world of networking, right? Like, you know, they might have like a layer 8 layer of networking where they're doing their own networking stuff. And it may seem repetitive, but it's probably better for them to invent their own world of networking than to mess with actual networking.
They're also the happiest if they don't have to figure out this low-level networking stuff. Michael, I think those were some excellent last words from your end. Thank you very much for your time.